I'm Luis Rodriguez.
And I'm Melissa Gonzalez, and this is Setting Mexico, the censorship of Mexican journalism. Journalism and freedom of speech in Mexico has been immobilized due to the acts of violence occurring in the area. Attacks on journalists and media outlets have increased since the year 2000. This is one of many reasons why Mexico is one of the most dangerous places in the world to practice journalism. The National Human Rights Commission has documented 82 murders of journalists, 18 disappearances, and 33 attacks on media outlets within the last 12 years. Due to this epidemic, journalists and media workers have resorted to self-censorship. Blogs and newspapers around Mexico have stopped informing the public of important news regarding the drug cartel, corrupt officials, and acts of violence because of threats they have received from such groups. From this silence, many consequences follow. Criminals retain their freedom, the public remains uninformed, and the citizens are unable to exercise their rights.
Y entonces estos señores pasaron a lo que les afecta a ustedes y a la sociedad, que es a la extorsión, al secuestro, al cobro de derecho de piso y a la intimidación. Porque se les dejó pasar, porque se pensó, es que si yo no me meto con ellos, no se mete conmigo, no. Pero ahora ya están hasta la cocina porque se les abrió la puerta y se asumen como dueños. Y lo que hay que hacer es sacarlos de la cocina, y lo que hay que hacer es enfrentarlos. Y lo que hay que hacer, ahora que ellos están asumiendo que son una autoridad distinta, porque ellos cobran impuestos, ¿no es cierto? Ponen sus leyes, tienen fuerza pública, que son, por cierto, las definiciones del Estado. El monopolio de la autoridad, el monopolio de la ley, el monopolio de la fuerza pública y el monopolio de la recaudación. Ese desafío al Estado tiene que ser combatido con toda la fuerza del Estado. Y por esa razón hay que combatir a los criminales, porque aquí el único dueño de la ciudad, o el único dueño del pueblo, o el único dueño de este Estado es el Estado mexicano. Y las únicas leyes que valen son las leyes mexicanas, y la única autoridad es la autoridad mexicana. Ninguna más. Punto.
True freedom of the press is a term challenged in Mexico because of government instability and drug violence. The understanding of how freedom of press is exercised is based on an intimate relationship with a prevailing government, from authoritarianism to liberalism. The fragile relationship between government and media in Mexico creates an effect in which freedom of press is challenged by political, social, and economic factors. As a transitioning government, the flaws of the Mexican government are intensified through their struggles with drug cartels, and thus create some limitations for the press. Some prominent factors on the limitations of exercising freedom of press in Mexico are a shortage of readers, the manipulation of facts in the circulation of press, influential discretion in the funding of publicity,
Manipulation of facts and the circulation of press supports the limitation not only created by the Mexican government, but also by drug cartels in which narco-terrorism acts as an important role. Authoritarian theory of the press is a theory that helps define the ideology that the press must always be working in favor of the state and never against it. The elite government officials will exercise control over the press by deciding what is allowed and what is not allowed for the good of the people. The press's functions and operations are controlled by organized society through the government. Even though the manipulation of press can be dated back to the early 20th century in Mexico, alliances made by government and drug cartels
officials and drug cartels in Mexico were created by social and religious connections, such as marriages and family ties. The merger between politicians and drug cartel members made their interactions socially acceptable in Mexico. It wasn't until the 1980s when newspapers transformed in Mexico and journalists began practicing civic journalism that politicians in Mexico would be questioned. Civic journalism is the idea that journalism is an obligation to public life. The obligation goes beyond just informing the public, but also creating a movement in which readers and community members become participants of social and political process.
Lo que usted escucha son disparos de arma fuego calibre de fusil, y también hay sonido más fuerte aún de lo que está ocurriendo en esta frontera en Reynosa. El enfrentamiento entre fuerzas federales y lo que viene siendo prácticamente alguna célula de delincuencia organizada. El armamento que usted escucha en este momento es un enfrentamiento entre fuerzas federales y delincuencia organizada. Agáchese, 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 agáchese.
Although civic journalism was starting to be practiced in Mexico, corruption within the management of newspaper began to create a feudal environment for journalists. Management support may be critical in helping journalists cope effectively with trauma. Corruption within the management of press also plays a role. The fear of writing extends all the way to the bosses of journalists who might be bribed into protecting the image of drug cartels. Without proper support, journalists in Mexico become helpless, which consequently creates a fear in doing their job. These fears can be related to the limitation of journalists in Mexico that is created by political and economic struggles.
Has been around ever since the hegemonic leadership of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. Peace was created by authoritative journalism. Authoritative power helped create a certain influence within government by setting an agenda. Agenda setting theory helps describe the ability of the news media to influence the importance of topics on the public's agenda. The relationship of media and policymakers is mutual and usually controlled by an official set of ground rules, as journalists need access to official information and policymakers need media coverage. This theory becomes very relevant on the topic of journalism in Mexico because for 3/4 of a century, hegemonic power controlled the Mexican government. Because of influential powers of the press, Mexican politicians, in relation to the PRI, were protected by positive portrayals of themselves in the press.
Although agenda setting theory helps us understand the influence that the media has on the public, it is also important to understand when the freedom of the press is limited, authoritative governments can use that power for their benefit. In the case of Mexico, the transition from an authoritative journalist practice to a civic journalist practice affected the fragile relationship between government and media. When an opinionated press began to leak sources of fraud and corruption around the country of Mexico, politicians and drug cartels began to retaliate, knowing that the influence of the public was important.
In relation to the United States, Mexican policymakers and organized crime groups, such as drug cartels, have tried not to get involved with American journalists. As a U.S. correspondent, it becomes much easier to cover stories about corruption in Mexico. United States journalists have the protection of its country and are completely aware of that
create a
protection.
wider range of sources and an ability to create a more purposeful story. U.S. correspondents had a different agenda when reporting on Mexico. Stories on Mexico and the United States have become about the negative aspects of the country, and thus creates a negative portrayal of the country. On the positive aspect of the reporting of Mexico is that U.S. correspondents do have the ability to report the truth about whether organized crime groups, such as drug cartels, are involved in a story.
So, what has your journey been like reporting in Mexico? If you can explain it in a few words.
Well, I feel like I've gotten a front row seat to probably the most tumultuous time in Mexico. As a reporter for the Dallas Morning News, but I think over the last 20 years, it is arguably the most important story for our region, for our hemisphere, other than 9/11. I mean, Mexico still depends, some papers more than others, on heavy advertising, whether it's the local government, the state, or the federal. So when the government controls the purse strings, it's a lot easier to manipulate, to influence the media. And I think that's what we've seen. I mean, it's been clear, I think, in the first few months, how maybe the whole narrative of Mexico has changed. You know, it used to be, we point a lot more on the violence. Now there's hardly that much reporting. And in some cases, it's justified, because I think in some places like Juarez, other regions, Nuevo León, Monterrey, things have slowed down. But I think in general, you still see the hand of the government influencing what the media prints. And I think that gives us a big difference. You know, I mean, that really tells you who the real editors are. Anytime there's any kind of danger, Ben, they step in, they move me out, they give me all the freedom in the world to make my decision.